Hello and welcome to the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices webinar on entrepreneurship initiatives for recovery and growth, states providing access to opportunity. Today, we are pleased to partner with the Marion Kauffman Foundation to host this webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about some state initiatives, specifically in Utah, Illinois, and a couple other states that are doing a lot of work to combat some specific barriers that pose, barriers to entry to access for entrepreneurship opportunities. These two barriers are non-compete agreements and occupational licensing. So I'm excited to jump into this conversation today. Next slide. On the agenda, we'll start with some brief introductions, and then we'll move to introductory remarks from each of our panelists, followed by an interactive panel discussion led by Jason Wiens from the Kauffman Foundation. And then at the end, we will have time for audience Q&A and discussion if time allows after that. I'm Rachael Stevens, Program Director for Workforce Development and Economic Policy at the NGA Center for Best Practices. So as we get started, I'll just briefly introduce NGA and the Center for Best Practices before we jump into the content today. Next slide, please. For those of you not familiar with us, the National Governors Association, or NGA, is the nation's only nonpartisan organization representing the nation's governors of our 55 states and territories. Through NGA, governors work together to identify common priority issues and address public policy at the state, national, and global levels. The NGA Center for Best Practices, where my team sits, is the only research and consulting firm dedicated to serving governors and executive agency leadership and helps them develop and implement innovative solutions to the most pressing public policy challenges they're facing today. Next slide, please. My team is one of several in the Center for Best Practices. You'll see on this list about over a dozen policy programs. So you'll see we cover a range of topics from healthcare to K-12 education to infrastructure to workforce development and public policy, which my team works with states on. We provide a range of services, including customized technical assistance opportunities, multi-state consortia and peer learning opportunities for you all to hear directly from your peers about best practices in their states, as well as research and published reports. Next slide, please. We also provide great opportunities to hear from leading experts at the national level, as well as from states who can deliver presentations on some of the great work they're doing. So that's what brings us all here today. I'm pleased to turn things over to our moderator for today's conversation. Jason is the Policy Director for Entrepreneurship at the Kauffman Foundation, who is supporting this programming and partnering with us to deliver it today. He directs the Kauffman-led Start Us Up Coalition, which recently published America's New Business Plan, or I should say updated their America's New Business Plan resource, which is one of the guiding kind of pillars that's shaping our conversation today. He oversees a portfolio of advocacy projects to educate policymakers on how government across many levels can support entrepreneurship. Before he was at the Kauffman Foundation, he spent several years on Capitol Hill in the Senate and House. So Jason, it is a pleasure to work with you and to have you here with us moderating this awesome conversation. Really excited to hear what you and the states on the panel have to share. So I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rachael. Excited as well to be here and to have this conversation. As Rachael said, my name is Jason Wiens, and I lead the Kauffman Foundation's entrepreneurship policy work. If you're not familiar with the Kauffman Foundation, we are a nonpartisan private philanthropy that's based in Kansas City. To build an economy that works for all people, we believe that entrepreneurship must be at the center of economic development policies, programs, and practices. And if there's anyone who's tuning in today who didn't think that entrepreneurship matters, my guess is that the last 18 months or so probably changed your perspective. Last year, between February and April, the number of business owners in the United States declined by 22%, which is the largest drop on record. And that happened just in a matter of weeks as the COVID-19 pandemic came to our country. I think we all experienced over the last year and a half how important new and small businesses are to our communities, our state, and our country. New businesses create nearly all net new jobs. They bring innovations to market, and they help revitalize communities. And of course, all of these new businesses started with an idea and an entrepreneur who was willing to take a risk. Unfortunately, government red tape, market concentration, and the outsized influence of established businesses can too often conspire to block aspiring entrepreneurs from fulfilling their dreams of starting and growing their own businesses. Rachael mentioned America's New Business Plan. That's the Kauffman Foundation published nonpartisan entrepreneurship policy agenda. We created that plan with significant input from entrepreneurs and policy leaders across the country. And this plan tackles these needs and other needs that entrepreneurs have. I'm glad that we have the chance to work with NGA and the Center for Best Practices to produce a series of webinars on these key needs: funding, knowledge, support, and today we're going to be talking about the issue of opportunity. This is the second webinar in our series. And as Rachael also said, we're going to talk about two very specific barriers that can limit Americans' opportunities to start new businesses: occupational licensing and non-compete agreements. Occupational licensing erects barriers to prospective entrepreneurs creating businesses that can compete with incumbent firms that benefit from the protection that licensing offers. Non-compete agreements can lock employees into their current job and hamper new business creation. And both of these issues, or these barriers, can often place extra burdens on women and people of color. A number of states have pursued reforms in these areas over the last few years. We'll get to hear about some of those today. And earlier this summer, President Biden issued an executive order to promote competition in the American economy, in part by addressing these same two barriers to entrepreneurship. So we have a really good panel discussion lined up to help governors' advisors understand these issues better and to help understand what form reforms can take and how they can spur more entrepreneur-led economic development in their states. So without further ado, I want to get right into our panel discussion. And I want to start by just asking each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and give us a quick high-level kind of overview of their interest in these issues and the work that they and their states or organization have done on non-compete agreements and or licensing. And so, Margaret, why don't we start with you? Glad that you could be with us today. Give us a sense for who you are and what you do in Utah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. I'm delighted to be here, and it's great to speak in a forum like the National Governors Association because I believe in really learning from each other as states. It's the best way to go. We know that states are the labs for democracy, as they say, and so I think it's really important to have these kinds of conversations. My position is I'm the executive director of Utah's Department of Commerce, and I was just appointed to this position with our new governor coming in, Governor Spencer Cox, and so I've been serving along with him. One of the main things that we do at the Department of Commerce is occupational licensing. So most of the occupational licensing in the state of Utah is done through the Department of Commerce. So we do licensing, contractors, doctors, real estate agents, securities professionals, cosmetologists, you name it, probably 100 different kinds of professions. And so it covers about 400,000 people in the state. So it's a large part of what we do. And on the governor's very first day, Governor Cox's very first day in office, literally on his inauguration day, the day before I started my job, he issued an executive order for all of his state agencies to do a full review of all the occupational licensing done in the state in order to look for ways to remove barriers so that people could access work more easily. And so we started out doing that. We did that for the first 6 months, and I'm happy to talk more about that and some of the findings that we had from that. But I think that mostly right now, I'll just say that it's a big priority in our state. It's a big priority of Governor Cox's. He recognizes that occupational licensing has been a barrier for people to work. And as you explained, Jason, a barrier for entrepreneurship because you need workers in a business. And when they have to get licensed, it creates a barrier.
Great. Well, thank you, Margaret. We look forward to digging into your expertise and learning more about what Utah has done under your and the governor's leadership. Jane, let me ask you, please, to introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Flanagan. I am a Deputy General Counsel and Deputy Chief Compliance Officer in the Office of Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. I echo what Margaret said. I'm delighted to be here and always look forward to learning from these sort of NGA opportunities. So it's a pleasure to participate. In my current role, I sort of advise on a range of legal issues. Sort of my portfolio focuses on labor, employment, workforce, and compliance issues. But I think I'm really in this webinar based on some of my prior roles. I was the chief of the Workplace Rights Bureau in the Illinois Attorney General's office for years. And in that role, I led investigations and litigation involving non-competes used for low-wage workers, probably a dozen investigations and or filed cases. And then following that role, I took a fellowship and was a visiting scholar at the University of Illinois, Chicago-Kent College of Law, where I kind of thought about and wrote about some of that work, non-competes, as well as other kind of restraints on labor market movement that are found in common employment contract terms. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll turn it back to you, Jason.
Thanks, appreciate it, Jane. And last but not least, Kenan.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and thanks, NGA, for having us here. So my name is Kenneth Fiery. I'm the research director at the Economic Innovation Group. We're a research and advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. that's dedicated to policy solutions and data that helps unlock those policy solutions to advance a more dynamic and entrepreneurial and inclusive economy all throughout the United States. And I actually come to some of these issues originally from the economic development angle, as non-competes and occupational licensing, erect barriers to the free flow of people and often therefore also ideas in an economy. I think we'll get into some of the role that entrepreneurs play and that non-competes sometimes get in the way of in the economy, I think, in the discussion. But our interest is very much in kind of finding some solutions on these fronts that free entrepreneurs and nurture the inherent dynamism of the economy without, or while at the same time boosting workers' rights, because I think there are a lot of win-wins to have in both of these spaces, and looking forward to talking about them. And EIG at the federal level, we're working to advance non-competes reform in a bipartisan manner in Congress. And then we also recently released a state guide to non-compete reform that lays out 8 different ways that states can try to chip away at this problem and refine the use of non-competes so that they have the smallest distortionary impact possible if they remain around. So thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Kenan. And actually, let's stick with you, if you don't mind, to kind of help us, I think, frame the webinar just a little bit more before we get into some of the specifics around licensing and non-compete agreements. You mentioned, entrepreneurship and its connection to economic dynamism. But what else would you say about why entrepreneurship should be a central part of states' economic development policies, and why these 2 issues in particular that we're going to be talking about today really matter in that context?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for asking. I think, and we're actually in a moment that's really, really instructive. If you look backwards, the 2010s was on all measures a lost decade for American entrepreneurship. We were kind of distracted from that by the flashy tech economy, most of which, they're no longer startups. They're about as big and as dominant as an incumbent can get. But the 2010s, if you look at take the startup rate, or the share of all firms in the U.S. economy that were opened, in the past year, that never recovered from the Great Recession, and then it crashed hard with the financial crisis, and that made itself felt in community after community across the United States. And as late as 2019, there were more firms closing than opening in that year across more than 3/4 of U.S. metro areas. So really, it was just parts of the Mountain West and the South that were actually kind of adding new firms to their economies on net, because the startup rate was so slow, not because the rate at which firms closed rose or was higher than historical norms. And this is one of the reasons the depressed startup rate is one of the reasons that the jobs recovery from the Great Recession was so long and slow, painful, that startups play a really important role in repairing the damage that downturns wreak on the economy. And that creative healing mechanism was lost, and we felt that for the better part of that decade. And to put numbers into context again, startups in 2019 employed 2.4 million Americans, which is great, but that's also the same number they employed in 1982 when there were the workforce was 57 million workers smaller. So that really puts the magnitude of really what we've lost in terms of dynamism into perspective. And both non-competes and occupational licensing, they get in the way of entrepreneurial decisions by Americans. And there are many factors contributing to any trend as big as this. But I think that means that any work that we can do to start chipping away at the problem is only going to yield dividends. Startups, they matter for jobs, as you said. They matter for all net job creation, or most net job creation in the economy. They also matter for wealth building, and they're very different from like attracting a branch plant if you're an economic development officer, right? Where that is really just getting you the job. But startups, they help build wealth and build community in a way that I think is really unique. And entrepreneurship strategies, they touch all your economy. If you attract that Amazon distribution center, you've done a great thing for your workforce or for your warehousing sector. But what about retail, professional services, education, healthcare? If you tackle these barriers to entrepreneurship, you're doing something on the policy angle that can really touch every sector and all the people there. So I think it's a very wide angle thing. So I don't want to blab on for too much longer. I'll start with non-competes and just say that they are detrimental to startups in two primary ways. So one, they prevent people from actually like spinning out of their existing employer because they have a better idea and starting a competitor. Sorry, that's actually how a market economy is supposed to work and how we advance and grow more productive. It's also how industry clusters grow and thrive. It's usually people who are alumni of another organization go and do something complementary or better. And it's the flow of people through an economy into different firms that actually make us more productive and make our local economy strong. And then they also, on the other hand, they make it harder for the startups that do, launch to attract and get new workers. So someone who has that great experience for 20 years as an engineer in a large firm might not be able to be poached by that startup to contribute building to a new company because they're locked into that old position. So it means that startups in the research are less likely to survive and grow in states that have strict enforcement of non-compete agreements. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kenan. That's great. Two things that you mentioned I want to just touch on briefly. One, you talked about, I think, and described very well the benefits of startups and why we in our states and communities and country need to see more of those businesses start. Sometimes I think there can be some confusion when folks hear that word startup and they have like a particular kind of business or a business in a particular industry, maybe perhaps often technology based. Our perspective at the Kauffman Foundation and the data that you're referring to, startup in the sense of a new business, right? Like of any kind. And so this is not just for some kind of businesses, this is new businesses. And we need, I think, a range of new businesses to create resilient economies. The second thing I just wanted to underscore is this idea you mentioned of kind of chipping away, right? Starting a business is hard. And so anything that we can do to reduce some of those barriers, to grease the wheels of entrepreneurial innovation and new business creation is a good thing. And so, looking even just at these two issues, non-competes and occupational licensing, it's not going to completely reverse the trend, the startup slump that we have seen, the stagnant rates of new business creation, but it certainly will help. Margaret, maybe, yes, Ken, real quick.
Sorry, real quick, I was going to say, especially with target demographics, so
yes.
Women and minorities, especially, often they are starting firms with less capital, and maybe for various reasons like supporting a family, less risk averse. So the threat of litigation, of starting a business in a non-compete environment or hiring someone under a non-compete can really, really dissuade them from entrepreneurship or harm, the business that they're trying to launch. But, sorry.
Yeah, no, good point. Yeah, thank you. Margaret, let me go to you next, and then Jane. Kenan has kind of given us already like a few or a bit of a sense as to like the why, like why should a state, focus on these issues? And you both have worked for governors and in states where like this has been a priority. The first day the governor was in office, Margaret, you mentioned executive order issued around occupational licensing. But if you could kind of imagine if that had not been the case, what are some of the arguments that you would make as to why a governor or a state should prioritize these issues? And Margaret, specifically for you on occupational licensing.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. It's a great question, because I think sometimes people think of like occupational licensing, why do I care about that? But first of all, Kenan, it was awesome to hear just the state of entrepreneurship. Some of those statistics I was not aware of, and it's pretty alarming, actually. So I appreciate that. I think, I would tell a governor that didn't care about this, these are the reasons to care about it. Occupational licensing reform. So one, the entrepreneurial piece of it that Kenan has already expressed. So if you can't hire, if it's harder to hire a cosmetologist, an accountant, a contractor because of really, really rigorous licensing requirements, that's going to really affect your business. So many occupations are licensed, and that creates barriers. And they're often licensed for reasons, and we can go into that. There's a balance between sort of protecting public health and safety, but also removing barriers so that people can get access to workers. So entrepreneurialism is the first thing. I think the other thing is that many groups benefit from specific groups that you want to benefit with your policy. Low-income people benefit from this. There's many sort of entry-level professions that require onerous licensing requirements. So cosmetology is one of them. We've struggled with this in Utah. We have beauty schools that, they love, the fact that the training, that 2,000 hours or whatever it is, a training is required, and that helps them. But it certainly doesn't help somebody that's just trying to get to the business of cutting hair. And so it helps low-income people. Other licensing reform that we've done, and I can talk more about this, but basically military spouses, people that are moving around a lot. When you have to move around a lot, getting relicensed in a new state is difficult. And I can talk more about that later. Certainly people with, immigrants and refugees, same kind of thing, right? They might have the skills, but going through the licensing process might be too much to bear. I think this is also really a bipartisan issue. You have people on the right that are worried about workforce supply, and I think everyone's worried about workforce supply right now, but workforce supply, but also just deregulation and allowing businesses to thrive. You have people on the left that are also thinking about access to opportunity. And removing barriers in occupational licensing can address both of those. And so people have probably seen that both Republican and Democratic White Houses have emphasized this. President Obama had a task force on it. I've seen some work just coming out of President Biden's administration as well. And so we went really far in our country on the road of occupational licensing, and I think it's time to kind of move it back a little bit. I think people of all stripes have recognized that it has done some harm.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, you've convinced me, if I hadn't been already convinced, that this is an important issue to work on. Jane, what would you say on non-compete agreements?
Well, I mean, I think some of the arguments around entrepreneurship and around our current labor shortages have been made well already, but those would certainly be arguments I would make. I think, I've been interested in and working on non-compete issues for years now, but this present moment more than ever really underscores how important it is to look at what keeps people from moving jobs, what keeps people from getting that next better job. And so we should really be looking at all of the factors sort of in the scope of an individual's career or career path or entrepreneurial journey, you know, whether that's working for an employer or starting a business, to say, what keeps someone from getting into a profession or building a path? And as they go along that journey, what are the roadblocks? And I think one of the points I would make about non-competes that I don't think is always made is we can think about a non-compete at the point you want to leave a job, but the impact is also felt while a worker is in a job, right? Like, how do most of us make more money? We get an outside job offer. And if you don't have a realistic possibility of leaving or an outside job offer or that competitor that's coming, and this is at any level, this is whether you're a low-wage worker who wants to get a manager job at a different, you know, fast food franchise, or can get a better chair at a better salon, or whether you're a sort of a more professional employee. Your employer knows if there's a realistic possibility of you're leaving for a better job offer, and that fact can raise wages and it can raise bargaining power, whether you're in the job or at the moment you're trying to leave the job. So I guess that would be another point that I haven't heard as much, but I would certainly make, is that we have to think about non-competes as well in terms of how we grow career paths and how we raise wages, frankly.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I like that point in particular you just were making around careers. You know, the economy looks a lot different than it did several decades ago when, you know, my father, for example, worked for the railroad his whole career, right? And he had opportunities to take different jobs and advance in that, but, you know, he wasn't leaving jobs and moving around as quickly as people have tended to in recent years. And entrepreneurship is part of a career for a lot of people, right? You know, like the average age of a first-time entrepreneur is actually around 40 years old. It's not kids in their dorm rooms creating new businesses. And sorry if you hear a noise in the background. We have housework, of course, today being done. It's 40 years old, right? So people have started in a career. They've gotten experience, and then they have an idea, and they have connections and maybe some money that they could put towards use in that. But if people are locked in because of non-competes or other barriers, it's hard for them to take those entrepreneurial paths. I'm going to ask a question so we can get off of my sound. Kenan, you mentioned that that EIG recently published a guide for state policymakers around some considerations that they should think through when it comes to non-compete reform. Can you give us a sense of what some of those considerations are?
Yeah, well, we'll do. So I think that if you're going to use a non-compete, you want to make sure that you want to level the playing field between the employer and the worker, however you can. So limiting the time that they're allowed to be in effect, or the geographic scope that they're covering are two important factors. So instead of 2 years in multiple states, maybe you're able to rein it in a little more. That's probably the smallest kind of bore angle that you can take. I think you can also go wider and exempt entire classes of workers from being covered by non-competes, because it's just blanketly unfair. And there's no plausible kind of power symmetry between the employer and the employee. And I think Jane can probably talk about some of the efforts that they've done in Illinois, right? That some states have decided all low-wage workers or workers below a certain amount or hourly workers are not eligible to be covered from a non-compete. And then you can also make employers, have some skin in the game if they want to use these. And right now, I think one of the biggest problems is that many employers see no real downside to just, putting them in the employment agreement and having folks sign. Whereas, then if you can raise the stakes and say, all right, employer, if you claim to have an interest in retaining this employee and not having them go work somewhere else, If that's true, you should be willing to pay them a portion of their salary, preferably a significant one, so it's an actual burden on the employer to enforce the non-compete as long as they're deprived of the right to earn a living in their chosen fields, right? So that's called garden leave in the lingo, and different states have pioneered some different models around that. So those are just a few. But there are ways again to chip away at it so it's used in fewer and fewer scenarios.
Great, thank you for that overview. Margaret, what about on licensing? I think you mentioned, that in some cases, right, there could be some really legitimate reasons why a state might want to put some regulation around the practice of an occupation. Health and safety often are talked about as, the primary reasons why licensing is needed. What are some, kind of considerations around, I'm guessing it's not necessarily a black or white license an occupation or just let people run wild. How do you think about kind of the range of things that could be done?
Yeah, and there are other ways to sort of more lightly regulate occupations than just a full sort of state issued license. That's kind of the highest form, if you will, of regulation. And so looking through, other options to sort of do a little bit lighter regulation, things like just requiring a registration. You have to register to do this occupation so we can sort of track it a little bit. We know who's there if something, happens or someone runs into some trouble or someone has a complaint or that sort of thing. Sometimes even sort of third-party certification, sometimes that takes care of it. So you might have an industry that just says, we kind of regulate ourselves and we say we just certify, and if you want our certification and you feel like that's a powerful way to get customers for whatever your work is, then great. But that's not something that the state is involved in. So those are just a couple of examples of sort of different levels of occupational regulation that don't have to be the full license. One of the things that we're going to be doing in the future, one of the things, sort of the ideas that came out of our lengthy review in response to Governor Cox's executive order, is set up an Office of Licensing Review that will specifically be looking at every single license that the executive branch regulates, not just ones in the Department of Commerce, but this office will be housed in the Department of Commerce at some sort of regular frequency. But it will allow us to review for all those things. Is this a profession that could be regulated in a lighter way and still have the same public health and safety benefits? So thinking through that, and then thinking through some other things like scope of practice, educational requirements, things like that. Maybe we need to rethink those things to be able to better enable people to get into the workforce.
Great, thank you. Yeah, a lot of different ways to think about this issue and how to address the barriers that occupational licensing presents. Jane, I want to ask you a question about kind of, and I'll tell quickly, I'll try a little story about when I first started learning more about non-compete agreements and reading some of the research that had been done on the issue. There was a story that came out about the sandwich shop Jimmy John's, which was asking or requiring the folks who were working at some of their restaurants making sandwiches, not it's a low wage job, they had them sign these non-compete agreements. And that story has always stuck with me. And it seemed to, at least in kind of, as I would tell, kind of the progression of like non-compete reform becoming more prominent among policymakers, seemed to have like played an important role because it illustrated that this is not just executives or your highest paid engineers who are subject to these agreements, but these are people with perhaps few other opportunities in the economy. And so can you just, I think you were involved in that in some way. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit more about that? Because if folks aren't familiar, I think it's an interesting story.
Sure, happy to. So I was working at the Attorney General's office. I was chief of the Workplace Rights Bureau at the time that we sort of became aware of this issue with the Jimmy John's non-competes. And we became aware of it actually through private litigation. So I think some sort of like low-level store managers had filed a private suit involving some wage hour issues in the Northern District of Illinois in federal court here. Jimmy John's is an Illinois employer, has many, many employees in Illinois. And in that lawsuit, I think maybe press picked it up, there were allegations that they were subject to these non-compete agreements. Those claims were mooted out when the company said, well, we just won't enforce your non-compete agreements to those individuals. But it kind of piqued our interest, and then we actually subsequently got a complaint. I think other Jimmy John's employees realized this and filed complaints saying, hey, I think I'm subject to this non-compete. And so it led my office at the time to launch an investigation. And I think what we found in that case is illustrative of what happens a lot in practice and sort of the mismatch between the legal framework that has regulated non-competes, which really is a contract-based framework, right? The idea that just two individuals bargaining over the terms of a job and when you're going to leave a job and when you can go to a competitor. And that's a framework that I think can work for a very highly skilled employee with a lot of bargaining power, right? But in practice, for example, in this Jimmy John's case, that is not what happened. What happened was employee starts on their first day and they have a pile of HR paperwork and they click through the boxes in the HR paperwork. And one of those boxes that they click through is the non-compete. And it applies to everyone in the company. This same non-compete applied to the folks that made sandwiches, the delivery drivers, all the way up. And so it's sort of this blanket application. And it does not actually take into account questions like, for example, do you have, confidential secret information? Are you going to take clients with you, right? None of those factors applied, for example, for these low wage workers in Jimmy John's. And so, but I think you're absolutely right in that it was illustrative because the press around that is then actually what led to a number of these other investigations. I think it kind of was an awakening moment for a lot of employees, and we started getting complaints from other folks, from dog walkers, from, I had kind of mid-level restaurants. We had a daycare investigation. We had a salon investigation. People realizing that somewhere in the terms of what they had signed, there was a non-compete. And typically it only rears its head when employees go to leave that job. And that's when they realize the ways in which they're constrained, essentially.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you for giving us a little bit more insight into that story and in your role when you were in a previous position related to that. Jane, maybe I'd like a follow-up for you, and Kenan, if you want to weigh in on this as well. This issue of like people not realizing that they were subject to a non-compete is interesting to me. I've seen research that even in California, a state where if you have signed a non-compete and you go to court, the court is unlikely to enforce that non-compete agreement. The number of workers subject to a non-compete is roughly the same as it is in any other state that would enforce it. So there seems to be a big issue just from like transparency. Have there been reforms that either of you know of that kind of try and get at that issue that still allow non-competes, but set in place certain rules around how an employer is to let an employee know that in taking this position, they would be subject to this restriction?
Sure. Well, I'll take a stab and then you should jump in, Kenan. I think there are two ways states have tried to address this point. One is some states have in their reforms passed sort of notice requirements, right? That if you're going to be subject to a non-compete in a job, you have to actually be told that prior to the time you accept the job, right? Because obviously if it's day one and you've already accepted the job, you've left the other job, you're in a much worse position to say whether or not you're going to agree to that non-compete. You're already in the job. The second, and I think Kenan referenced this earlier, is kind of this idea of like putting a little teeth in overuse or non-competes that are too broad prior to these state level reforms, there really wasn't the cost of trying to bind a worker to a non-compete that was too broad was typically just that a court, if it ever got challenged, would rewrite or modify the non-compete to be more reasonable, or would just strike it, right? But again, if we think back to that Jimmy John's example, they're using it for the entire company. I think it was two plaintiffs, two individuals challenged it. The company says, okay, we won't enforce it for those two. There's no cost in regards to the widespread use for the rest of the employees covered. And so some of these state level reforms have started to look at actually making that usage illegal and having penalties or other sort of costs associated with that broad overuse. But I don't know if you have other things to add to that.
Thanks. Kenan, anything else?
Yeah, just a little. So I think that, you know, you're absolutely right that the opacity or lack of transparency is a major issue here. And for states, especially states that maybe where the politics of real dramatic non-compete reform is likely not on the table, it is hard to argue with the fact that or it's hard to argue with suggestions that people at least know that they're going to have to sign these at the time that the offer is made and are given adequate period to review them. And that's just transparency and information that, you know, should allow everyone to make the right decisions. So I think that can be a really great place to start because, you know, part of the problem today really is it's in the information asymmetry and the power asymmetry. So anything that you can do, even on the process side, if you're not able to reform how they're actually used or whether or not employers are able to use them at all would be beneficial.
Great, thank you. Margaret, I'm wondering if you've seen similar transparency issues on licensing. My suspicion is that if you're a cosmetologist, for example, you know, or you knew before you got into that you had to complete training, maybe perhaps pay fees, pass tests, do other things. I'm wondering maybe if it shows up more with, you mentioned military spouses, you know, like or others who move across state lines. You know, it's like, well, I got my license in Kansas. I didn't know that now that I am a resident of Utah, I have to like go through this whole process again. Have you seen anything like that?
I think that is a little bit of an issue, although I think because states have borne down so much on licensing, people don't have the transparency, you know, the opacity issue as much with, like, as you've talked about in the non-competes. But you know, it's the issue of sort of transferability is just a really important issue. You know, and it sort of kind of bumps up against like the kind of idea of states' rights, frankly, right? But I think that more and more states are realizing that they want to make their licenses more transferable. I'm not really saying it the right way. It has to be a state that says, we accept your license. If your license, if the state that you had your license initially issued in or once issued in, for instance, Kansas, Jason, your example, we actually have looked at those licensing requirements. We find them mostly similar to what we do here in Utah. And so we're just going to be able to give you, you know, a license without, you know, as long as you were in good standing, didn't have any problems with it. That is a really easy reform to make, by the way, because it requires a little bit of work. We've done that work. You can go to our website and look at like how we've sort of figured out this endorsement, going through, okay, if you come from this state, you can do this. At this state, you can do this, because we did actually all the research on the different states' requirements. But that really is an easy thing to do, because it really doesn't have anything to do with compromising the public health and safety. It's just a bureaucratic move. That's all. So, and it really helps the military and military spouses and other people that are moving frequently.
Yeah, good. Thank you. That's helpful. I have used a number of times as a resource reports from an organization called the Institute for Justice, which has cataloged 100 or more occupations that are licensed in various states, and in some cases, you know, compared, you know, in state A versus state B, same occupation, but sometimes the requirements can look vastly different, which is kind of like leaves you, I think, to scratch your head and wonder, like, practice cutting hair in Kansas again and Utah is not different. I don't think. I'm not a barber, right? But so we should, it seems, be able to agree on like a common set of minimum requirements if licensing is deemed to be necessary in an occupation, so that we have the ability to have this transferability more, so that people are not impeded from economic opportunity when they move across the state, which I think, Kenan, you guys might have research on this, like fewer people are moving in the United States than used to be the case. And if economic opportunity is concentrated now in fewer places, which you mentioned an EIG report on this very issue, like this is a problem for the economy if people are impeded from going to where jobs and economic opportunity is. Margaret, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was going to say that exact point is just that we already have a mobility problem. And so it's almost less about coming to Utah and finding that you can't get a license. It's not even moving in the first place because it's a barrier. And that actually probably is a transparency issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I want to ask a question about COVID because, gosh, I think not to address what's been, I don't even know the word, changing our lives, like bearing down on all of our lives for the last year and a half would be an oversight. Kenan, have you seen any effects on in your work, EIG works at national level, among like policymaker interest on these two issues? Like has COVID and the economic effects of it, do you think, made these issues more salient or policymakers more interested in making reforms in licensing or non-competes?
Yeah, I think it's definitely opened a window for reform from both sides of the aisle. So on non-competes, now that the labor market is so gummed up, I think there's real appetite, and the urgency now is not retaining your workers; it's in getting new ones. And you don't want to run into a non-compete that obstructs you from that. So I think we might find more sympathetic chambers of commerce and folks on that front, on the non-compete reform right now too. And also early in the pandemic, I think there were some stories, and stories have been really powerful in advancing reform here, as you noted, but stories about folks who were laid off and then subject to a non-compete even after being laid off. That's another reform you can implement by making that an exempt situation. So it's also helped bring some attention in that respect too. And then on occupational licensing, I'll let others speak on that one.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this question of COVID and how the change in kind of the environment maybe is creating new opportunities for reform?
I'll just mention on the occupational licensing front, one of the things that happened here in the state of Utah, and I would imagine this is probably similar to what happened in other places with the onset of COVID, is that we had a huge need for people, for more healthcare workers, essentially, to come in and be, administering the tests. And then certainly when we got the vaccine, administering the vaccines, and just in general, more need. And so what happened here at the Department of Commerce is that we loosened the requirements of folks that could do some of the sort of entry-level healthcare work. So we actually we sort of temporarily suspended the requirements around people that could administer shots and administer tests and so forth. And so we were able to allow people that were in school for nursing or some kind of medical training. And that allowed a lot more people to help out. But what it also showed is, are the requirements we have in place right now really the right ones? Are they too much? Because, hey, these guys were able to get in and it was not a big deal. And that really speaks to this idea of making sure that our licenses have a good scope of practice, that they're not so broad that they essentially restrict people from getting into them because you have to do so much training, right? I mean, the examples of like healthcare is great because you have doctors and then people thought, okay, we're going to actually create a different profession, nurse practitioner, physician's assistants, people that can do a lot of the same things as the doctor, but not everything, and it requires less training. So doing that a lot more, not just in healthcare, but certainly in healthcare as we need it, but all over the place, is a way to allow people to enter the workforce more meaningfully and sooner. So I kind of call that concept micro licensing, and that's another thing we're going to be looking at a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting to think
I would
about
echo
that.
that
Yeah,
we,
Jane.
oh, sorry. I was
No,
just going to echo that we also did that in Illinois, temporarily suspended and expanded our scope of practice considerations as well as our out-of-state recognitions to just allow as much movement of the folks we needed on the ground as possible. And I would also agree that, you know, the sky didn't fall.
Yeah, I'm curious
so
to
it's
see what.
definitely worth looking at sort of longer term.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes these things that we it's kind of like crisis, and so we feel like we have to make some changes. Then maybe show us, oh, well, maybe we can make more changes, or this temporary change that we make, it could become permanent now, and we can do this perhaps in other ways as well.
Well, just the labor force shortage in general, as we've already spoken to. I mean, this is a long-term crisis. I think we're going to be in for a while. And so it's going to force all sorts of different reforms on this front and others.
Yeah, that's
It's
maybe
really
a good trend. Yeah, go ahead, Kenan.
Oh no, just yeah, that's it's like almost I mean a real switch in era. Like again, like the 2010s was an era where there were plentiful jobs, low-wage jobs, and lots of people to fill them. These things could kind of accumulate. Labor didn't have much bargaining power, but it's been a total flip in the other direction now, and it seems like a lot of these things are right for being disrupted and transformed a little for the next era, and I think largely for the better. If we're able to solve the shortages, don't want those, but they're forcing some changes, which is good.
Yeah. We have about 5 minutes or so left, so maybe just very quickly, one question I wanted to ask, and I think it gets to what we're starting to talk more about. You know, we started the webinar. At least I tried to make the case. Kenan, you made it really well, I think, about why these two issues matter in the context of entrepreneurship. But they matter in other issues as well. We've been talking about labor mobility and the labor shortages that are out there and economic dynamism. Are there any other like points that you, Jane, Margaret, Kenan, you feel are important in kind of like other contexts around economic policy? You know, set entrepreneurship aside for a second, that we haven't made that you think are important for folks to understand when it comes to licensing or non-compete agreements.
So one thing I've been working on and thinking about a lot in my current role is workforce training, and Governor Pritzker has just launched a governor's run commission, workforce commission on equity and access, to essentially say we suddenly have federal dollars to spend on workforce. In Illinois, our workforce system is quite fragmented. We have data gaps. And so we are really trying to go to the drawing board with outside stakeholders, with employers, with workforce providers, with community colleges, trainers, with workers advocates, to say, what does training for our new contemporary workforce look like? What should it look like? How do we measure that? How do we think about career pathways? And the reason I'm bringing it up in this conversation is I think part of what we want to be thinking about is also, and what is a quality job or a quality opportunity? And to me, part of what makes a quality job or opportunity or the right fit for a person is, can you get in? How do you get the capital and the supports you need to get that training or to get that opportunity to start that business? And then can you move from there? What are the obstacles that keep you from moving there, right? And some of the obstacles might be a non-compete or some hidden sort of contractual term that keeps you from moving. It might be that you're in an environment that's, discriminatory. It might be lots of things, right? But how do we kind of think about job quality and opportunity of jobs in a much broader way, and in a way that ties into skill and opportunity? I think kind of marrying this idea, this is my whole sort of interest and orientation, but how do we marry sort of job quality with opportunity and mobility, and skill building opportunities? So that's something we're beginning to grapple with here. I think it does come out of the pandemic, but will be an ongoing process, obviously.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. Well, guys, I think we've had a really rich discussion about these two issues that create barriers to entrepreneurship, non-compete agreements and occupational licensing. To wrap us up, I want to just give each of you maybe a minute or so to give us a sense about what comes next on both of these fronts. Where do you see the next phase of policymaking occurring on these issues of non-compete agreements and licensing? And Margaret, maybe we'll start with you first, and kind of what are you guys thinking about when it comes to this issue in Utah?
Thank you, Jason. So we're really excited to pursue a couple different things. One is, I've talked before, I guess, about how we've done some work to be able to enable military members and military spouses and folks that are just coming across borders and across state borders to be able to access licenses more easily. The next frontier with that is really around helping people with foreign credentials, so people that are immigrants and refugees, be able to license them more easily. So everyone kind of remembers, times when you've been, I don't know, in a cab or something, and you're talking to someone that was trained as a doctor from Bangladesh, but they can't work in this country as a doctor. So trying to address some of those issues. And then the other big thing, and I've already talked about it, is this Office of Licensing Review, which is going to be really the mechanism by which we stay current and relevant as regulators, as licensing or occupational regulators, and really sets up Utah for long-term licensing reform, because all of these licenses are going to be looked at in a very systematic way.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Well, we'll look forward to seeing what comes of those efforts. Jane, when it comes to non-compete agreements, where do you see things moving in the year ahead? Oh, Jane, sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry. For the governor's office, I think I've mentioned some of our efforts around sort of entrepreneurship, workforce training, and kind of freeing up career pathways, and really looking at how we do that. More broadly, I think in terms of non-competes, I think where policymakers are likely to go is looking at other kinds of restraints that tie up labor markets. We've seen some cases involving franchising, like no hire agreements in franchising. There's been some work I've seen recently on training repayment agreements. If an employee receives training, they have to pay back some sum. So I think that policymakers are beginning to kind of broaden their focus and look at what are other kind of contracts that are tying up workers' ability to move or to start new businesses or be entrepreneurs.
Right, right. Very good, cool. Thank you. Kenan, I'll give you the last word of our panelists. Where do you see things headed?
Okay, thanks. I see an exciting couple of years of legal wrangling ahead, in the sense that the FTC is now really looking at non-competes, taking them under close scrutiny. I think they're going to have to figure out how much they can do within their mandate in kind of enforcing these as anti-competitive, which it's in the name, right? But the statute that they're beholden to, I think, has some ambiguities that I think the lawyers on the panel know more about than I do. And also, it'll be interesting to see how that interplays with Congress at the federal level too. I think that really legislative action may be essential for at the federal level for the kind of non-competes problem to be really dealt with in a systematic way across the country. So in the meantime, while that's kind of while the FTC and Congress are dealing with that, we're going to see a real flurry of reforms at the state level continuing. I think with each passing year now, we see usually at least 20 states passing some sort of non-competes reform. And I think that's going to continue, and it'll be a nice kind of laboratories of democracy at work in the experimentation phase there.
Right, very good, thank you. I appreciate Kenan, Margaret, Jane, all of your perspectives, the insight and the experience that you've brought to this discussion. I know it will benefit everyone who tuned in today and will watch this on video. For those who are watching, if you're interested in learning more about various policies that impact entrepreneurship, you're in luck, because we have 2 more webinars scheduled with the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices on these topics. The next one will be occurring at the end of October, looking at kind of the intersection of workforce training and entrepreneurial skill building. So be on the lookout for information from NGA on that. And with that, we're going to close out. Thanks everyone for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, guys. Third time's the charm. I think we got it.
Before we get off,
Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Great to see y'all. Bye.
Yeah, Margaret, did you have something?
quickly, before we get off, so one of the things the governor's tasked us with is to do a regulatory review specifically around barriers to entrepreneurship. So I may reach out to some of you to I've hired a program manager to start thinking about this, but I would love her to have a chance to kind of pick your brains on some of these things. So we're trying to figure out what are the pain points, and part of that process will be like reaching out to actual entrepreneurs. But I'd love to talk to experts as well.
Great. Sounds cool.
So I'm glad for the connection. All right.
Okay.
Good to
Have
see
a good
you.
weekend.
All right,
Thank you,
bye-bye.
Katie.
Nice to meet you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.